Good morning, my friends. God, pull me out of this pit. Life is suffering. That much is undeniable. The moment you wake up and truly see the world, you recognize that it is riddled with hardship, with betrayal, with malevolence, some of it imposed upon you by others, some of it, if you are honest, brought about by your own hand. And there will come a time, if it hasn't already, when you will find yourself in the pit deep, dark, and suffocating Dynamitkirk. That is an undeniable truth, one we often try to ignore until it forces itself upon us with a weight we can no longer bear. From the moment we are born, we are fragile, vulnerable, and subject to forces beyond our control. Pain, loss, illness, betrayal, these are not exceptions in life. They are the rule. And if you are not suffering now, you will be. That is not pessimism. It is reality. People find themselves trapped in situations they never anticipated, drowning in despair, suffocating under burdens too heavy to carry. Perhaps it is the loss of a loved one, an unexpected tragedy that rips through the fabric of their world, leaving them disoriented and broken. Or maybe it is something more insidious, a slow erosion of meaning, where the daily grind strips them of purpose, leaving only exhaustion and resentment. And then there are those who have been betrayed by the people they trusted, by the institutions they relied on, sometimes even by themselves. When suffering strikes, it often brings isolation. People retreat inward, convinced that no one else could possibly understand the weight they carry. But isolation breeds bitterness, and bitterness, left unchecked, breeds a hatred that can turn inward or outward, poisoning everything in its path. It's easy to curse existence in those moments, to see the world as a cruel, indifferent place where suffering is senseless and hope is nothing more than a fleeting illusion. And many who fall into the pit remain there because they believe there is no way out, or worse, that they deserve to be there. But suffering itself is not the enemy. It is an integral part of life, and it serves a purpose, though that purpose is often obscured by pain. People are quick to ask, why is this happening to me? But rarely do they ask, what must I learn from this? There is a fundamental difference between the two. The first assumes victimhood, a passive acceptance of suffering as a cruel trick of fate. The second acknowledges that suffering, though unavoidable, carries the potential for transformation. There are those who have endured unspeakable horrors, war, abuse, injustice, and yet have emerged not as broken victims, but as people of immense depth and strength. What separates them from those who remain shattered by suffering? It is not that they avoided pain, but that they confronted it, looked it in the eye, and refused to let it define them. The reality of suffering is not something to be ignored or dismissed with empty platitudes. It must be acknowledged fully, deeply, even painfully. It requires a brutal honesty, a willingness to see life for what it is, rather than what we wish it to be. Only then can anything truly change. When suffering takes hold, it does not merely bring pain. It speaks. It whispers, then shouts, then settles into the mind like an ever-present shadow. And the voice it carries is not one of encouragement. It is the voice of despair, the voice of self-doubt, the voice that tells you to stop fighting, to stop hoping, to let the weight crush you entirely. It is the voice that says you are worthless, you are beyond saving, you deserve this. That voice is seductive. It offers a strange kind of comfort, a justification for inaction. If you believe it, you no longer have to try. You no longer have to struggle. You can stay where you are, resigned to your fate, blaming the world, blaming others, blaming God, blaming yourself. But that path leads only to destruction. It may begin as sorrow, but it quickly festers into something darker. Resentment is its first child. It starts with a sense of unfairness, perhaps rightly so. Life is unfair. Some suffer more than others. Some are born into misery. Others have it thrust upon them by circumstances beyond their control. But resentment does not seek to rectify anything. It seeks only to grow. It turns suffering into justification for hatred of others, hatred of the world, hatred of oneself. And hatred is a fire that consumes everything in its path, including the person who carries it. Despair does not only manifest as inaction, it can also drive people toward destruction, both subtle and overt. Some destroy themselves slowly, numbing their pain through vice, addiction, and self-sabotage. Others lash out, ensuring that those around them suffer just as much. The belief that nothing matters, that no effort is worth making, that there is no escape from suffering, this is the foundation of despair, and it is a lie. But it is a lie that feels true, especially when repeated often enough. That voice must be confronted directly. It is not a friend. It is not wisdom. It is a parasite that feeds on suffering and multiplies in silence. The longer it is entertained, the stronger it becomes. It takes hold. It is relentless, ensuring that every failure is proof of incompetence, every setback a sign of worthlessness. Even the possibility of change is dismissed as an illusion, a cruel joke played by those who do not understand true suffering. People believe they are thinking when they listen to that voice, but they are not. They are being spoken to by the darkest part of themselves, a part that thrives on keeping them weak and broken. That voice must be challenged, resisted, drowned out by something stronger. It cannot be reasoned with, only silenced through action, through truth, through an unshakable refusal to let despair dictate the course of life. It is not an easy battle. It requires vigilance, effort, and an unwavering commitment to rejecting the lies that suffering tells. There is a moment when suffering reaches its peak, when the weight is unbearable, when the darkness is so thick that it seems impossible to escape. It is in that moment that a choice must be made. One path leads further downward into despair, resentment, and destruction. The other path, though narrow and steep, leads upward. But that path cannot be taken alone. The first step is to call out, to acknowledge the need for help, to admit that the burden is too great to carry in isolation. To cry out is not a sign of weakness. It is an act of courage. It is an admission that something greater is needed, something beyond the self. That cry may be directed toward God, toward another person, or even toward the depths of one's own soul. But it must be sincere. It must be an acknowledgement that the pit is real, and that staying there is not an option. That is the beginning of movement. But crying out is not enough. There is a temptation to believe that help alone will be the answer, that someone or something will reach down and pull everything back into order. But no one can do that entirely. Help can come, but it is not a rescue. It is an invitation to climb. And climbing requires action. It requires looking at the wreckage of life and making the painful decision to take responsibility for it. Even when the suffering is not entirely self-inflicted, there is always something that can be done to begin setting things right. Taking responsibility is difficult because it demands truth. It demands an honest assessment of what led to this place. Have there been lies, cowardice, complacency? Have there been moments where responsibility was ignored in favor of comfort? The answers to these questions are not pleasant, but they are necessary. Because without truth, no real progress can be made. Truth reveals what must change. And change, though painful, is the only way forward. So responsibility begins in small steps. It is not about fixing everything at once. That is impossible. It is about identifying the first thing that can be changed and then changing it. Maybe it is as simple as getting out of bed on time. Maybe it is repairing a broken relationship. Maybe it is acknowledging an addiction and taking the first step toward overcoming it. Whatever it is, action must follow recognition. A single step, no matter how small, is still movement. And movement, however slow, is the antidote to stagnation. There is resistance in this process. The old patterns, the old voices, the old habits, they do not disappear overnight. They pull, they drag, they whisper that it is easier to remain where things are familiar, even if that familiarity is misery. And that is where resolve is tested. The call for help must be met with a willingness to act. No one else can do the climbing. No one else can take the steps. The responsibility is personal, and it must be accepted fully. The process of climbing out of suffering is not immediate. It is not clean. It is not free from setbacks, but it is transformative. Every struggle against despair, every rejection of bitterness, every act of responsibility reshapes the individual. The person who enters the pit is not the same as the one who emerges. The suffering does not simply vanish. It is integrated, understood, and in some way even redeemed. Pain has the power to crush or to forge. It breaks those who allow it to define them, those who surrender to the belief that suffering is meaningless. But for those who endure, who wrestle with their suffering instead of submitting to it, something remarkable happens. Strength is built in direct proportion to the weight that is carried. The deeper the suffering, the greater the capacity for transformation. The pit, as terrible as it is, can become the place where a stronger, wiser, more capable person is born. This transformation is not just personal, it extends outward. A person who has suffered deeply and overcome it is someone who can bear the burdens of others. They become a source of stability, of wisdom, of genuine compassion, not the shallow, naive kindness that ignores reality, but the tested, unwavering kind that knows what it means to suffer and still chooses to stand. This kind of person can speak truth into the lives of others because they have lived that truth themselves. The act of climbing out of suffering is the foundation of meaning. Meaning is not found in comfort, in ease, or in the absence of struggle. It is found in responsibility, in the voluntary confrontation of hardship, in the willingness to bear suffering without succumbing to it. This is why those who seek only happiness find themselves empty. Happiness is fleeting. It cannot sustain a person through the inevitable trials of life, but meaning can. And meaning is forged in the fire of suffering. There will be moments of doubt. There will be times when progress seems invisible, when the climb feels endless, when the temptation to fall back into despair is overwhelming. But the smallest step forward, no matter how insignificant it seems, is still progress. A single act of defiance against hopelessness, a single refusal to be swallowed by the darkness, is enough to shift the balance. Strength is built incrementally in each moment where suffering is met with resolve instead of resignation. The past does not have to dictate the future. The mistakes, the failures, the pain, none of these are final. They are chapters, not conclusions. The person who has suffered is not broken beyond repair. They are in the process of becoming something more. And through that process, they not only change themselves, but also offer something invaluable to the world. They become living proof that suffering, though real and often unbearable, does not have the final word. Thanks for watching.